All right, Genesis 17. It's not a text often preached on, for sure. Why don't we read 17:1 down to, we'll just finish the chapter. We will get into a good way into chapter 18 today, just to notice some things that are there, and they will help us get some insight into some things that go on here in Genesis chapter 17. The title of the message today is Abraham's Response to the Covenant of Circumcision. Abraham's response to the covenant of circumcision. Why don't we begin reading then in Genesis 17, verse 1. Before we do that, let's pray specifically for our time in the Word. Stan, would you pray?
Father, I remember that Abraham in particular is referred to as the father of all who believe. Certainly, we want to give attention to this man toward whom you showed so much favor and through whom you've done so much. I ask your help for Chad this morning as he undertakes to teach yet more on this particular covenant here and everything going on in this passage, and tries to help us see its importance and just how much it steers the rest of your history and your dealings with us.
Yes.
It's very important, Lord, and we all want to see that. We want to be also encouraged by your dealings with mankind, with Abraham, and with everyone you've sought to bless from his day onward, and how you've done that, and how you've brought that to fullness in Christ. Lord, we ask that all these things would be very present to us today. You would just teach us and show us these things, and that through them you would strengthen us. Amen. In Christ.
Amen. Verse 1. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession. And I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both he who was born in your house and he who was bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. And God said to Abraham, As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name, and I will bless her, and moreover I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And God said, No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. When he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all those born in his house or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. All right. So, this covenant of circumcision, we've spent 3 weeks now in dealing with this. The first week, we considered this 13-year gap between Genesis 16 and 17, right? We have at the end of chapter 16, the last verse, Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. In the very first verse of chapter 17, when Abram was 99 years old. So Moses is drawing our attention to this. There were 13 years that have passed here. And we saw some various details and things that had happened in those 13 years, major changes that had happened in the lives of our characters involved here. And we'll look at some of that here briefly. Then we considered the significance of circumcision, what it means, what it signified. We took as our text from that the only place in the Bible where it explicitly tells us exactly what circumcision signified. Namely, Paul says in Romans 4:11, it was a seal to him of the righteousness he already had by faith before he was circumcised. So we had to figure out a way to make those fit, make that statement from Paul fit with what we read here in the text and understand it according to what Scripture says we ought to think about it. We did that. We'll talk about that briefly again. Then last week, the last time I spoke, we considered the covenant of circumcision in redemptive history and what God was doing with it. What was the purpose of this covenant? We also find in the very next verse in Romans chapter 4, namely verse 12, or 11 and 12, that Paul explicitly says what the purpose of this covenant was. So Romans 4 is a massive help to us in understanding this chapter and what God was doing. So then now we find ourselves dealing with Abraham's response to the covenant of circumcision. But in order to grasp his response, it's necessary, I think, and just even in the message, to kind of set the stage and again remind ourselves of exactly what has been going on so that we can see it clearly and get the emphases the way the Bible intends for us to get. So I want to just somewhat briefly, review Abraham's dealings with God so far, or we might say Abram's dealings with God so far, because it's not until this chapter that he's given the name Abraham. So until now, if we go back to Genesis chapter 12, we'll just try to quickly see some things here. In Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, we have the calling of Abram. Now the Lord said to Abram, this is just out of the blue. He wasn't a worshiper of God, right? You remember elsewhere in Scripture, particularly Moses goes out of his way to tell us, and Joshua as well, that Abraham was in fact an idolater. He was serving false gods and very much involved in pagan religion. And in the midst of that, God appeared to him and called him out of that and away from all that to come serve him in a land he did not know, to follow a God who was real but he didn't know, into a land that he didn't know. And so here's this call. And now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. There are at least 5 things I want to point out in these 3 verses. I know those of you who were here when I taught about this before, I gave a very specific structure to these verses, and it's a very helpful way to understand them. But I'm not going away from that structure. I'm just kind of going to identify 5 things that happen here. First is the command to leave and go, right? Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house. So that to leave all those things and go where? To the land that I will show you. So leave all this behind and go. So your comfort, your religion, your family security, the homes you know, the land you know, the farms, the fields that you own, leave it all and go somewhere else that you don't know. Go to a land that I will show you, right? I mean, just get on your journey and I'll tell you when to stop. I mean, this is the idea, right? Just I will show you this land and you'll know what it's the land when you get there. So first, the command. This is essentially a call to convert, right? To abandon your former religion and just venture everything on me. And so this is what he does, because this is the only God he's ever met who's real, and he follows him. And then there's this promise God makes in verse 2. And you do that, so it's a conditional promise. If you will leave everything and venture out on me, I will do something for you. Here's the promise. What will I do? I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I'll make your name great. So a threefold promise. Abram's going to have a great name, God's going to bless him, and he's going to be made into a great nation. That's what God will do for him. And then God gives this expectation that we don't often see it that way in our English translations, but it's very plain, especially in the original, but it's plain here if you really are thinking about it. What's the purpose or God's expectation of Abram? What's Abram supposed to do with all this blessing and this great nation and this great name he's supposed to do? So that you will be a blessing. God's intention in calling Abram out of his idolatry unto himself, into a land he didn't know, and then blessing him was so that Abram would be a blessing to other people, right? That was God's intention. That's what his expectation is. So there's a command, there's a promise if you obey the command, and then there's expectations about even if I do all these other things I'm promising you, that's not really the goal. The goal is I want you to be a blessing. And he says, now then, if you'll do that, verse 3, there is some partnership and protection that you're going to get from God. He's going to enter with you. If you will join God in fulfilling the expectations, his desire for you, Abram, he's going to partner with you and protect you. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. Right? So those people that bless you and count you a blessing will receive a blessing from God. But those people, down to a man, notice it goes singular here, him who dishonors you. Every single person who regards you lightly and thinks nothing of what I have you doing out here and all that I'm doing in your life, those people who dishonor you and mistreat you and brush you off, down to a man, I will curse them. What a thing. Extreme protection and extreme partnership. And then there's this tremendous purpose. We thought, well, it was one purpose for God to have in mind for Abram to be a blessing. But he has a tremendous purpose in mind. He says, and in you, if you'll do these things and you'll seek to be a blessing, I'm going to be with you, and you'll find that this plan to be a blessing will be so successful that all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's what the end game is. All the families of the earth shall be blessed. So this is kind of what sets the stage for all of Abram's life and really redemptive history from this point forward. So then, what do we find? Well, in skipping over a few things, just kind of picking up on the highlights, Abram finds himself kind of in unbelief down in Egypt. He gets to the land God has said I'm going to give him. God told him to dwell in that land. Things aren't very good, and he says, I'm going to just kind of keep passing through. And he gets on down to Egypt, and then he's really scared because he knows exactly what kind of people these people are, what Pharaoh's like, and he has a suspicion that his beautiful wife is going to be a source of temptation to them. He's had this fear all along. This is the way people are, right? When you don't have the law to tell people they can't do things, they tend to do them. They're a law unto themselves, and that's not a good thing. And so they get to Egypt, And he reminds Sarah of what they agreed upon when they left Haran, and they lie. And Abram gets rich, and he absolutely fails. He was supposed to come to this land, receive blessing from God, and be a blessing. And he goes and he finds himself passing right on through the land, skipping whatever God had for him there, ends up in Egypt, and is lying. He's made rich, but he lies, and he loses his wife in the process. And he's happy to kind of go his way, but God won't let it go, because God called him for a certain purpose, and God intervenes in the situation and miraculously reveals to Pharaoh the lie that Abram had told. You can imagine Abram's fear here. But God, evidently, we read in the Psalms, God had also warned Pharaoh not to lay a hand on Abram, not to retaliate. And so he didn't. And he let him have everything that he had given him as a dowry for his supposed sister. And he gave him his bride back. And not only had he given Abraham many things, but Lot as well. They'd all gotten rich, and sent them up out of the land not to be harmed. And so Abram goes tail tucked back to the land of Canaan, full of regret, full of shame, but also, don't miss this is the big thing, not just failure in Egypt, but full of repentance when he comes back. In Genesis chapter 15, we read, verse 3, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, where he'd first come and met with God, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. He comes back. He's like, you told me this was the land where I was supposed to dwell. You told me this is where you would bless me. I failed you completely. Here I am again. And he comes back to the altar to deal with God again. So there's tremendous repentance. And we see that, if you wonder, well, how much did he really change? We see it illustrated in the very next story. Abram was the kind of guy who showed up in town and began to manipulate and think and scheme how he could come out ahead and how he could manipulate the situation so that he won. That went miserably in Egypt. He comes back, he's repentant toward God. The very next thing, he and Lot have controversy about their flocks and their herdsmen, and it's not going well. And the old Abram, a month ago, would have said, okay, I got an idea. Lot, you're just kind of with me on this journey, right? Why don't you go home? Why don't you, something like this. This would have been Abram's response. But instead, he says, Lot, I'll tell you what, you choose what you want. God is going to take care of me. Whatever you decide is fine. And Lot, just like he had learned, no doubt, from his uncle Abram, had decided what? He was going to take the best land for himself. Well, if you're saying it's my choice and you said it, then I'm going to take all of the land, which is the best land for me. And that's what he did. And so what do we find? We find, verse 14, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So God rewards this, not by immediately giving the land to Abram, but by promising to Abram that to him and to his offspring all that land would be his. God rewards this faith and this repentance that Abram had demonstrated. So we find that. Then in the next chapter, we find that Lot's decision had gone badly for him. He had taken the best part of the land, but living in the best part of the land meant everyone wanted that land. And there were foreign kings and armies who, maybe just out of a desire to be wealthy, maybe out of a genuine need in their own land, had traveled across the known world to put the kings in the realm where Lot had lived under allegiance to them, and they had to pay tribute to them year after year to take their crop and give most of it off and send it to these foreign lands so that they could have peace and not be slain. So Lot kind of made a bad choice in a way. And the local kings decided to rebel, and they were no longer going to send their tribute. And so these foreign kings came in to destroy them, and destroy them they did. And they took all the land, they took the people as slaves, they took all the goods. And when Abram heard of this, what did he do? He risked all to go rescue his nephew. The snotty-nosed brat nephew Lot, who took everything for himself. Abram went to go rescue him, and he rounded up all the men that he could, and he went out at night and he chased these guys down, and ambush after ambush after ambush, he recovered everything that was lost. We see him seeking to be a blessing with the help of God, right? He's going to help these people. He didn't need to. He could have just kind of stayed put. I mean, the land, he wanted the land, and guess what? I mean, he could have, if he was thinking of it, if he was just out to say, how's God going to give me all the things God's promised me? It looks like a pretty good opportunity. This foreign army came and just took all the inhabitants out of the land. It's like, hey, it's vacant, right? It's all mine. Thank you, Lord. But he goes out and risks his life to go rescue these people. That's profound. He'd become a different person than he ever had been before. So God had been moving in Abram, and over the years he has become a changed man, slowly and surely. Then in Genesis chapter 5, so he's wildly successful in that. And then in Genesis chapter 15, so the way all that ends is you would think if he rescued all these people, he would either get all their stuff as payment and thank you for that, or he would win their allegiance and they would want to serve him. But in fact, the way Genesis 14 ends, he gets nothing. The people go back and follow whatever of their old kings were still alive. They don't follow him. There's no real allegiance to him. And he doesn't get anything either, because he made this promise, and he rightly made this promise to God that he wouldn't take anything that they would give him, because he didn't want it to be said that, well, he only got rich by taking all the stuff that these other guys took from us. And so he didn't want that. He wanted to honor God. And in honoring God, he found himself empty-handed again. And so he's just kind of wondering. And then what happens if these foreign armies come back in their strength the next year when it's time for war? What am I going to do? I've made a lot of enemies here. And the people that should be on my side aren't really for me either. They're snakes. What do I do? Well, Genesis 15, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. So God seeks to assure him and to reestablish his confidence in God and to bolster his faith, that it would grow and mature, and this present trial, this present cause for fear, that Abram would be able to meet it. And God doesn't just look at him and say, now, you should be stronger in faith. God comes to him and strengthens his faith. And what does he do to him to strengthen his faith? He comes to him and says, don't fear. Right? And then, now this is all in a vision. It says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. So Abram, think how visions work. Abraham's like asleep, and this is a night vision, or he's awake, and he's kind of, in some kind of a trance or something, and there's this vision that comes upon him. He's seeing all this as a spectator happen in his vision, the same way we are reading about it and imagining it happening. So he's got this vision, and God speaks to him in this vision, and then Abram, in the vision, responds to God. Now, the way this works is these are probably the real fears that Abraham had, but he hadn't yet been so bold as to speak them to the Lord. And he finds himself in the vision speaking to God, and you could imagine he might be saying, oh, don't speak to God like that. Don't say that. But yet it's really what's in his heart. If he's honest, it really does need to be dealt with. This is the thing. Oh, Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. Right? And you might think Abraham saying, no, you have more confidence in God than that. Yeah, but if he's honest, he does wrestle with this time and time again. And this is this plaguing doubt that just won't go away. And here it is. God's going to deal with it. And Abram said, behold, you've given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said, this man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and number the stars if you're able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abraham sees God saying that. And then what does Abraham see? Or what is it revealed to Abram in the vision? And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. It's revealed to Abram, and we know that because Paul says it in Romans, that this was recorded, this was revealed to Abram for Abram's sake. Abram needed to know that God wasn't waiting for Abram to perfectly perform everything in order to bring this to pass. And so it was revealed to Abram in the vision that even though he'd failed so many times in various ways and hadn't been all that he maybe could have been for God, that because he was believing God to do what God had promised, God was counting him as perfectly righteous, as though he had righteously fulfilled every expectation God had had upon him. This is This is a watershed moment for Abram, just like it is, if you're a believer in Christ, a watershed moment for you. It changes everything. Once you know that I'm righteous, God sees me righteous by faith. I just trust Him, and God's not going to hold those sins against me. My failures are not going to be an obstacle to God's purposes and blessings for me. So there we have that. And then God deals with this other concern that he had about the land. How I know that I'm going to possess it. And God makes a covenant, swears a covenant to him. Right? We talked about that, where he takes these animals, as much was custom in the day, and he slays these animals and lays them slain down like an aisle to walk down. And then God passes through, swearing an oath to him as he does it, making this covenant, essentially saying, if I fail to do what I'm promising to do, then I'll share in the fate of these animals. And that's incredible, because it's the living God. Like, he's not going to die. So as God essentially saying, as I live, this will come to pass. What a thing. He says, they will have the land. What's going to happen? They're going to go through 400 years of slavery. They're going to come back, and they're going to have all this land that I'm telling you. It will happen. So we have that. Then in chapter 16, we get on the heels of this great encouragement to faith for Abram, and we find a number of years later, he and his wife desperately moving forward. There's this bad idea to use Hagar to supply a child. We've talked about this extensively, and that this was common custom in the time. Right? You weren't able to provide a child for your husband, you provided him with a substitute wife. That was just common. It's not even just common like because we see it in this text. Archaeologically, we have it all over the cultures in the period. So this was common practice. It's not a good practice, it was just common practice. And they had all kinds of laws and things about what happened when things went really badly in these situations, because they almost always did, as you can imagine. Like, this is a recipe for disaster domestically. But it happened. And they decide to do this. It's Sarai's suggestion, not Abram's, not Hagar's. It's Sarai's suggestion. And so this was this bad idea. Abram fails in that, and the story is cast this way, right? The same way as the fall in the garden, where Eve took of the fruit and gave to her husband, and he listened to her. It's the same thing here. Sarai takes Hagar, gives to her husband, and he listens to her. It's the same kind of failure on the man's part. He listens to his wife in her enticement towards sin. In the temptation, he follows suit. He should have known better. He should have resisted. He should have been confident in God. Look, the response should have been something like, God has brought us all this way. He's sworn an oath to us. He will bring it to pass. I know it doesn't look like it, but we're going to depend on God. Until God shows up and tells us different, we're going to depend on Him to do what He said He'd do. He didn't do that. He didn't do that. So, and then Sarai, Hagar gets pregnant, and Sarai fails miserably. Not only had she already failed with this idea of hers, but she also failed because she treated Hagar terribly. She abused her. The words used here are the same words that are used for the way that the Egyptians treated Israelites. And it's so bad, Hagar flees for her life. She doesn't know where. She just runs for her life, even when she's pregnant. It's awful. None of us would think well of Sarai if we had seen this. It's awful. And Hagar fails as well. What happens? She gets pregnant. She starts strutting around like she's the chosen one, and she's the only one who Abram really loves, and she's the preferred wife, in a sense, even though in Abram's mind she was still just a servant. So all that happened. Hagar leaves. Abram doesn't care. Sarai doesn't care. Nobody goes after her. They send her. She's out in the desert, and they don't care anything about her. But God cares, and God's character is shown to be vastly different. And that's the main point of this chapter. It's not actually don't run ahead of God. It's that see the character of God in contrast to all these people and the way they respond. God shows up, and the main point of the whole thing is that God is a God who sees and cares and acts. And He did all those things for Hagar. But He sent Hagar back to repent from her sin. He sent Hagar back so that Sarah would repent of her sin. And He sent Hagar back so that Abram would repent of his sin. And God's purpose all along is the same. He means to use Abram as a source of blessing to the nations. And He's not going to do that unless Abram goes through at least these next 13 years living in a home with Hagar and Sarai and Ishmael, and all the controversy and the conflict that's going to come from that. And these people are going to have to learn to get along and to go forward despite all their mistakes, despite how screwed up the situation is now. They're going to have to grow in godliness, in humility, and in patience. They're going to have to be something they can't be now by the help of God. And that's what happens. We find in Genesis chapter 17 and 18 and these chapters that follow. I won't go through all these areas now, but remember we picked up on all these clues, how you see how the situation had changed. And these people were different people. It was wonderful to see. Now, the end of chapter 16, repentance, essentially we could say, is begun. The message is conveyed to Abram and Sarai, all the things that the angel had said, and this long walk of repentance begins for the next 13 years. Which brings us then to this covenant of circumcision. That's a lot of review. Okay, here we are. It's the setting. I want to talk about its setting, the setting for this covenant of circumcision. The Lord appeared to Abram and announced His appearance with exalted language, like a high king, right? He appears to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. What a thing, right? I mean, imagine some person comes in, opens the door, and we said, who are you? And they just, I am, what are they going to say? He says, I am God Almighty. God's never said that yet in Genesis. He's not come out and said anything like that to anyone. But He says it here, I am God Almighty, like a high king. The Lord summons Abram to a higher level of righteousness and to live out the rest of his days in a way that's more consecrated to God's will and more consecrated to God's purpose. He says, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. Right? Two things there. Walk before me. Have a consciousness and an awareness of God and of who I am and my purpose and mission for you. And in that, be blameless. What a thing. He summons him, commands him to something higher. That I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. What else does God do in this setting? He changes the name of Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah. Now imagine if the President of the United States or someone had come in, or the mayor of our town or the governor of our state had come in and said, walked into your home and showed up and said, I am the governor, I'm in charge, and from now on your name is going to be, like, what in the world? Right? We see here the absolute superiority of God. He comes in as a king and claiming all rights. And He dictates to Abram what the covenant's going to be, what the conditions are, how it's going to be moving forward. And Abram either responds or he loses everything. This is just the way it is. You know this to be true in your own life, right? You're going along with God, everything seems good, and suddenly God puts His finger on something, some area of repentance. And it's like before long, you wrestle with God on this thing and you realize like you're going to either walk away from God over this issue or you're going to repent and have God. And that's just the way it is. And God comes up and says, here's the way it is from now on. This is the covenant. This is how it's going to be. Take it or leave it. You've got a new name. And I'm going to tell you what the conditions are. Now, the Lord determined the covenant sign as well. There'll be a symbol between us about this covenant arrangement. What's the symbol going to be? This is not the symbol Abram would have chosen. Right? Circumcision had existed in other cultures, some, and for various different reasons, but Abram was 100 years old, 99 years old, and he'd never been circumcised. It wasn't his culture. It wasn't part of his people, what they did. And nobody in his house had been circumcised. So it was rare enough. But here they are, and God says, this is the sign. That's what I've decided. This sign is going to represent total commitment to me and total dedication to my cause, which is what this covenant was meant to establish as a new norm for Abram, right? God comes in and He calls him to this higher way of living, more consecration. It's meant to establish a new level of walking before God. We know this sometimes in our own life. You have times, right, you kind of have steady growth as a believer, sometimes up, sometimes down, you kind of grow. Then something happens, and you can't explain it, but it's like you're here now. And then you're up and down from there, but it's like there's like kind of no going back. You're just at a greater level of godliness and maturity in your life. God shows up to Abram and says, okay, we were at 60%, but it's going to be 75 now. We've got to be here, right? It's that kind of thing. And I don't mean putting percentage on it is really not very helpful, but you understand. God's not after 3/4 obedience. That's not what I mean. But just He's calling him to something higher and deeper. What else do we see? The Lord determined to use a child of His own promise and His own miraculous doing, and not a child already had by Abraham, or by Abram, who Abram loved. I mean, Abram loves Ishmael. He pleads for Ishmael in this. It's his only son. He thought it was the son of promise. I mean, God said you're going to have a descendant. You're going to have lots of descendants. They're going to be as many as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. And it was told to Hagar that Ishmael would be multiplied so that he could not be numbered for multitude. So it seems like he's the one. And God says, no. It's going to be through Sarah. It's going to be through Sarah. What a thing. So not only does the king show up and offer and demand greater repentance, demand greater consecration, greater levels of holiness and commitment, he changes your name. He gives you this sign, which is really kind of regrettable for you. And then, what else does he do? Then he says, oh, and your kid's not good enough. I'm going to give you another one by your wife. It's incredible. And then Abram seeks to alter the plan. No, God, how about Ishmael? And God says no, and he refuses. There will be no negotiation in this covenant. I've decided. He comes in absolutely as a sovereign and determines what will happen. And then when he gets done speaking, verse 22, when he had finished talking, let's look at verse 21. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. End quote. The very next thing we read, when he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. So it's like he says the last word and he just turns and walks away. And Abraham's kind of, wait, but it's over. And you're just left thinking about what God has said and how you're going to respond. And the blessing is, I've said the text this time, or the message this time, is God's response to the covenant of circumcision. Verse 23, then Abraham took Ishmael his son. And he did it. That very day it says he did this. What a thing. So that's the setting of this covenant of circumcision. Now, its significance. How significant is it? What does it mean? And I'm trying to still work, in a way, we're still kind of reviewing and setting the stage for things here. According to Romans 4:11, he received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. It was a covenant sign between God and Abraham moving toward this high purpose in Abram's initial calling. Remember, he was initially called out. God wanted to bring this blessing to the world. And this was a covenant sign between God and Abraham, getting them to that purpose. It was a covenant sign for the parents. This is an interesting thing. We often think of circumcision as something that you undergo. And it was for Abraham. But for most people, most Jews who grew up in the covenant, I mean, it was something done to you and you didn't even remember it happening, right? Think how this command comes to Abraham. You will be circumcised, your children, all the people born in your house, all the people bought with your money. You're going to put all of these people through this. And if you don't, we're done. What a thing. It's, in a sense, it's a test for Abram more than it's a test for those people. It was a covenant sign for the parents to mark all the males in their home in this way. That they would be bearing this mark, they live, their children are at God's disposal. They're under the command of God. They're on God's side. They bear God's covenant mark. They belong to the one who himself, to Abram, who had related to God in that way. And they themselves are going to relate to God in this way. They want God to work in their family the same way God has worked in Abram's, right on through until you eventually get the blessing. It was a covenant sign given to further assure Abram of God's intentions and to further reveal those intentions and to further reveal those plans. God was moving forward with His plan with Abram. Despite Abraham's past failures, God was going to move forward with him. Just as before, so also now he's being called to further service, almost priestly service for God in the world, as though he had honored and pleased God all this time. I mean, God gave him a command and certain expectations, and Abraham is not really, he's grown, but he's really not done that well with those expectations. And then God comes in and says, okay, you're going to be my man. I'm sure about you. I'm going to covenant with you for this purpose. And it's almost shocking. I mean, you'd think, Abram would have spent the last 13 years anyway kind of wondering, well, we haven't heard from God in a while, and things haven't been great at home. They're getting better, but we sure aren't seeing a lot of blessing. We're not getting many kids. And this is kind of it. And then God shows up and says, no, I'm sure. You're my guy. You're the one. I'm going to covenant with you, and not just for you, but even your kids after you. But let's get serious now. Now we're moving forward. And that acts for Abram as a seal for him, that God meant what He said when He counted him righteous by faith. And all those failings aren't going to derail what God has done and what God is determined to do. God's so sure of it, God is going to enter into a new covenant with him to reach these purposes, to work with Abram and his descendants. It's a tremendous blessing. God's going to act as though He had done the right thing all along, never failed him. God's revelation to him about 20 years before in Genesis 15 about being made righteous by faith was still true. Now, this covenant, though, in Genesis 17 has some conditions. It has some conditions and assurances. The conditions: walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant with you. It's going to require greater levels of godliness from Abraham. That's for sure. And the other condition, circumcision. Any uncircumcised male who's not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He's broken my covenant. Right? So the covenant stipulations: walk before me and be blameless, that I can make this covenant with you. But then also there's a covenant sign, like a wedding ring, and you've got to have it on. And if you refuse to wear it, you refuse to take that sign, you're cut off. You'll have no part in this covenant and these purposes that I have for Abraham's descendants. But then there are some wonderful assurances that God gives. Abraham's going to be multiplied greatly or exceedingly. Abraham shall be the father of a multitude of nations. Before, I'll make you a great nation. Now, you're going to be father to a multitude of nations. Look out, see the nations. Look at the vast multitude of them. You're going to be a father to them all. What a thing. You're not just going to be made into a single great nation with innumerable descendants, but now you're going to be made the father of a multitude of the nations. Kings shall come from him, we read. The covenant will be an everlasting covenant, or a perpetual one. It's not just going to be made with Abram, but with Abraham's descendants, to be God not just to Abraham, but also to his descendants. Now imagine the blessing of that. What would you be willing to do if you could secure for your children that God would be God to them? Like, you would do a lot. We do a lot, right? We do what we do as parents, seeking to raise our children to know God, that God would be their God. And God is telling them here, look, not in maybe the same way we mean it as believers, but God is saying, I will be God to them. I will be the one that they look to for protection. I'll give them victory in war. I'll secure their borders. I'll provide for them food and rain and health. I'll provide descendants, children of blessing and not of children of sorrow. Prosperity to them all. What do you look to a God for? Well, people look for prosperity. I'll give you success in your efforts, not continual sorrow and frustration, if you'll follow me. Wisdom and guidance, right? I'll give them direction in dealing with others and navigating the difficulties of the world, how they should deal with the kings from the foreign lands. I'll help them in all those things. Respect and honor, right? Your children will come to identify themselves with the character and the ways of God. They'll judge men on the basis of what God thinks of them. They'll find their own importance and their own status in their relationship with God and not in other things. What a thing. What a tremendous assurance from God. What else? Sarah shall have a son, promised by God to them in the midst of otherwise barren and hopeless circumstances. What a thing. And then this purpose. What's the purpose of this covenant? Well, we read in Romans 4:12, 4:11 and 12. The purpose of this covenant. Romans 4:11. This is staggering if you've not seen it before. The purpose, what's the purpose of this covenant of circumcision? Was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. So, summarize that. The purpose of this covenant of circumcision, God's purpose, was to ensure, he was going to come in and bring this covenant of circumcision with Abraham and his descendants, to ensure, to guarantee that the blessing of justification by faith, which is another thing, which Abraham already was enjoying, to guarantee that that would eventually come to all the nations. That's why the covenant of circumcision comes in, is to guarantee that the blessing that Abraham already had would eventually come to all nations. Evidently, in the plan of God, this covenant arrangement about circumcision was a necessary means or a necessary step to securing this blessing and getting it to the nations later on. Now, when that blessing finally did come to the nations in the time of Christ and in the church age, right, when that blessing came to the nations, it would come to them whether they were circumcised or not. It wouldn't matter if they were circumcised. That's what the text says. So circumcision was never a necessary step for any one person to secure their blessing before God. Rather, it was put in place by God in order to separate the descendants of Abraham from the world, to make their distinction from other peoples to be chiefly along these lines of their knowledge of God and their service to God and their relationship with God, their anticipation of all that God had promised and of the things that He had prophesied. Their distinction from other peoples in the world would be religious, not racial, not geographical, not cultural, would be religious. It would be in God's determination to be their God, to bring His purposes of blessing to all the people of the world through them, and to make their Father a father to all nations. That's how they would be distinct, in those ways. And the covenant of circumcision begins to do that. It's those first steps in bringing that to pass. God wanted a people through whom He could prophesy and give a revelation who would pass it down so that later, when the promised seed would come, things were ready the way that He wanted them. And circumcision began that process. This is how it begins. That's the purpose. That was the whole purpose of it. All right then, so Abraham's response to God. We have finally, after 45 minutes, have arrived at the point of the message today. And it really will go quickly. I want to consider his response in several headings. First, emotionally. It was an emotional response. Look at Genesis 17 and verse 3. Then Abram fell on his face. That's all you read. He fell on his face. What did Abraham do? He fell on his face. Why? Why did he fall on his face? I think he fell on his face in reverence and fear. Right? It was a response of worship. That's part of it. It was God Almighty who was before him, right? We just read, it was God, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you. This was an appropriate response to the greatness of the one appearing before him. I would say if someone were to appear before you, you were to have some vision of God Himself, and you were persuaded and convinced this is in fact God, you ought to fall on your face. Like it's just the proper response. It's the natural response when a man comes in contact with God. This is what he does. It was full of reverence and fear. But what else? He also fell on his face in awe and in trembling. It says the Lord appeared to Abraham. So this isn't just, sometimes maybe you have a sense of the presence of God, right? You have that as a believer. There are times when you feel God is near, He's with you. We're not talking about that. This is an appearance to the eyes. He saw God in some way. The Lord appeared to him. Now, later on in Genesis chapter 18, we see the Lord appears as a man. I don't think that's probably how He appeared here, because it doesn't say anything like that. So it's some other thing. And He appeared to Moses in a burning bush. How did He appeared to Israel in the Shekinah glory? How did He appear to Abram here? I don't know. But it was otherworldly. Right? He fell on his face in awe and in trembling. Just would compare this maybe briefly. One text that I think of in Revelation chapter 1, verses 12 through 18, we read this. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white like wool, as white as snow. His eyes were like a flaming fire, and his feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. And his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun, shining in full strength. Now that is what we might be tempted to think a hyperbolic way of talking, like, well, this is kind of exaggerated. And even if you say, well, it's not exaggerated, and I'm going to try to imagine in my mind what that looks like, you're missing the point. Like, if you look at this and you're imagining some kind of creature like from Lord of the Rings or something, right? And you're thinking, oh, I could see like this kind of character. You've missed it, because you would see that creature and gawk. But what does the next verse say? Verse 17, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Right? So however you read this description, you should be trembling when you're finished at what John is seeing. And then you've begun to kind of get an inkling at what he's talking about. And he fell at his feet as though dead. And now we're saying here, the Lord appeared to Abram, and Abram fell on his face. It doesn't say as though dead, but he fell on his face. There's something just fearful and awesome about the appearance. He responds in that way. He fell on his face also, I think, glad to see and hear from God again. It's been a long time. And I've been wrestling with this for a long time now. Is God done with us? Or is He? And I feel that way for a while. And I say, no, that's not true. God promised. I'm righteous by faith. Like those, I can't look at the times I failed Him and say it's over. God, I know it's been a long time, but God's going to come through. And He's wrestling with this again and again. And then finally God shows up and removes all doubt. And it's tremendous. So He's full of gladness to see and to hear from God again. He had no real reason to know God would appear to him again, nor did he have some way of calling down God down whenever he wanted to speak to him. Right? I mean, he couldn't just say, Lord, I've waited long enough, come. That wasn't going to happen. He didn't stay, or God didn't come down to him when he called. I've got this nagging doubt I want you to answer for me. So God, here it is. Now give me an answer. That didn't happen. He had to just walk through this long time without any extra word from the Lord. He had to work through these things slowly with much difficulty. His faith in God grew bit by bit with fits and starts, just like all of his spiritual children. So when God showed up in such a manifest and distinct way, it was a joy, among other things. Yes, there was reverential fear, and there was physical awe and trembling, but there was also joy. So it was a tremendously emotional response. Now what else? He responds to God verbally. He says some things, first to himself and secondly to God. Let's look at this in chapter 17, verse 17. Now this is a little bit different way of falling on your face here. It's a little bit embarrassing in a sense. So God says what he's going to do for Sarah. She's going to have these children. And Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, he said to himself this time, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Right? So this is what he says to himself. It's a very different sort of falling on his face. Here, this falling on his face is clearly associated with astonishment, with a feeling that the whole thing that God's telling him is a bit inappropriate and strange and kind of not really what Abraham's after. Right? It's associated with laughter at the unlikelihood of this ever coming to pass. Sort of you might say, like, what in the world is God talking about? Why now? Why Sarah? Why me? Like, what? We have a kid? Like, this is, I don't understand, God. What in the world are you doing? The idea that Sarai would have a child was not in his mind. It was anymore, anyway. It was not something he was hoping for. He's been getting very comfortable with Ishmael as his heir. He's not really eager to see his 90-year-old wife bear a child. They had painfully closed that chapter in their lives. Right? And it surely was painful. But that chapter was closed. The idea that God would open it again seemed almost inappropriate and out of place. He didn't want it. But it doesn't stop there. Quickly, as all of this settles into his mind a bit, and he said this to himself, he has an understanding that if Sarai is going to have a child and all the blessings going to come to that child, that means Ishmael would not inherit all that God had promised Abraham through his descendants. And from that way of thinking, he speaks then now to God. What's the next thing say? We read what he said to himself, verse 18, and Abram said then to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." So he pleads with God for his son Ishmael. He does this because he loves him. And he probably admires him some, if you think about this. Ishmael already has the promise of God that he will become a great many people. So many that they cannot be numbered. Abraham has every reason to think that he would be the one through whom Abraham would become a great nation. Right? God said, I'm going to become a great nation, have descendants that can't be numbered. I've got a kid, and he's also been given that promise from God, so I think he's the one. So he's been confident, in a sense, that Ishmael is the child. Also, while the angel's words in Genesis 15 are likely a little bit perplexing when you try to match them with God's words about blessing to the nations, what do I mean? In Genesis 15, it says that Ishmael is going to be a wild donkey of a man, and everyone's hands are going to be against him, and he's going to be against everyone else's, right? And then he's going to dwell over against his brethren. It's like, this doesn't sound very peaceful. God had said through Abraham he's going to bring blessing, right? It's going to be a good thing. Ishmael sounds like all this conflict. But even though that's hard to bring together, God told me I'm going to have descendants that can't be numbered. And he said this kid's going to have descendants that can't be numbered. He's probably the one. So he's kind of wrestling with this all the time. So even though this is a bit perplexing, this thing, it's probably somewhat inspiring though, and you think about it. A source of admiration to see the way this wild boy of his was growing up to come out ahead all the time. He's always in conflict. People are picking on him and he's getting back at them, but he always seems to kind of comes out ahead. And you might wonder, Abraham doesn't see a bit of his old self in this boy, right? But he's just kind of better at it than Abram ever was. It's kind of admired. It's the kind of thing you see a movie like that, and you watch some kid, or you know a kid in your neighborhood like that, and you kind of root for him. You're like, everybody's always against him. And I know he deserves half of what he gets, but he's a fighter. And I appreciate that in him. And you could imagine Abram feeling this way about his boy. All these adversarial relationships that he has, and he keeps coming out ahead. He's got a fighting spirit. Everyone's against him, but he continues to grow. He's got God's promise that he's going to prosper. And he keeps going on. Why abandon this boy, Lord? Like, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. I've been invested in this kid. I teach him, every other night I get him down and we just have time together and I talk to him about things and all that God means to do. And he's not always all that interested, but look at him. He's my son. He's Ishmael. Let him live before you. Let him be the one. Beloved, we do this all the time, just in our own life. Like you have something that's dear to you, God means to give you something better, and you argue with God because you don't want to let this thing go. You want plan B, right? Your own, like, God, look at it. Look at all this affection I have for Ishmael. He's wonderful. And you just begin to praise God for all the things, the reasons this thing is something God shouldn't take from you. And God it's like He's just saying, just let it go. Okay, I've heard you, Abraham. I'm going to take care of that, but trust me in this. There's something else I have in store for you that's far better. One commentator, Alexander McLaren, long guy from way back in the past, who I really appreciate, said it this way: Abram's thoughts were turning to Ishmael as a possible substitute. His wavering confidence was steadied and quickened now by this new revelation and what God would do. We too are often tempted to think that in even the highest matters, the most important things, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, right? And to wish that God would be content with our own Ishmaels, which satisfy us, and that He would not withdraw us from the possessed good that we have in order to make us live by hope of good that's not yet seen. We need to reflect on this vision of Abram when we are thus tempted. That's very well said. There's a lesson for us right in that, in his pleading for Ishmael. God refused him. Now, of course, again, God rejected this request, though He honored Abram's love for Ishmael and brought him a blessing as a result of Abraham's pleading. He said, I'll make him 12 princes. He'll be great. I'll give him a further blessing, not just a lot of descendants that can't be numbered, but I'll make sure there are even 12 princes that come from him. And that happened as a response of Abraham's pleading. The last thing to consider, and we'll wrap up with this, is Abraham's response to God substantively. We've seen it emotionally, we've seen it verbally, some of the things he said, but now substantively. When I think of this text here, you remember there's a story Jesus tells about two boys. And the father makes clear what he wants the boys to do. And the one boy says, yes, Father. And then he just doesn't do it. And the other boy says, I'll not do it. And then later he thinks, I'm all right. And he does it. And Jesus says, which boy did the will of the Father? And everyone says, well, the second boy, right? And here's Abram. And God says, this is what it's going to be. And Abram says, no, Ishmael. God says, no. And then he leaves. And Abram's left there thinking. He says, all right, I'll do it. And he obeys. And he submits to the covenant, right? I'll bear the mark. I agree, God. These are the terms. I submit to you. Where else will I go? Right? And he obeys. Immediately he obeys. When he had finished talking with him, verse 22, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son and all those born in his house or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. Abram was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskins. That very day Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. Now, let me dip down into chapter 18 to show you something here. Let's look at verse 9. These visitors come to Abram, the Lord visits, and they said to him, to Abram, where is Sarah, your wife? And Abram hasn't told him anything about his wife Sarah and what her name is and anything. And he said, she's in the tent. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent of the door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years, the way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? Is she not laughing just the same way Abraham laughed? Her words are basically the same. He's old and I'm old. And it's chapter's closed, we're done. This ain't going to happen. She's laughing when she first hears the news, the same way Abram was laughing when he first heard the news. Now, I think that's agreed. And let's just stop for a second. What happened in the meantime? Abraham first heard the news. Sarah doesn't know anything about it yet. Abraham goes out and gathers up all the men and circumcises them all. Sarah still doesn't know what's going on. I mean, you imagine, what the word around camp, what is he doing? I don't know what he's doing. He just said, God told him, I don't know. He said he'll talk later. He's not telling us anything. Right? It's not clear. He goes immediately and does this. He's not like conferring with her. It's not her decision. It's not any of their decisions. It's not Ishmael's decision. It's not Eliezer's decision. It's not any of these people. None of these people who live with him. It's his call. And he's going to go on with God. And that has consequences for the whole camp. You can imagine the talk for the next couple weeks. Right? Then they're all healed up and these visitors come. And Abram says, okay, and we're going. And he still hasn't gotten around to telling Sarah anything. We don't know that he's calling her anything different at this point. The text is calling her Sarah and him Abraham. But we don't see any words from them saying anything. We find that later, but not yet. Where's Sarah, your wife? You can imagine you imagine she's in the tent going, Sarah, it's Sarai. What is he talking about? And Abram's like, well, she's in there. Like, don't tell him what my real name is. What are you doing? She's going to have a child. And she just starts laughing. She learns about it then. And my point in bringing that up is mainly to talk about how immediate and careful and absolute his obedience was. He wasn't equivocating. He wasn't looking for somebody to talk him out of it. He's left there. God leaves, and he's sitting there, and he realizes he's got one choice to make. And he just goes forward. And it's not a matter, there's nothing to discuss. Line up, boys. Here we go. Like, this is what, it's just going to happen. What a thing. That very day, it was immediate, it was careful. All the men. There wasn't, we read about a lot in Israel's history. They weren't always very careful to kind of thoroughly carry out the command. All of the people, all of the men in his household were circumcised that very day. Not half today, half the next week, half some, like, it wasn't that way. It wasn't kind of by fits and starts. Everybody. If this is the condition, if this is what God means to give me, and this is the condition of having it, I'm all in. We're going to do it. What a thing. So he had not told Sarah about it. Now, I think there's a lesson for us there too, and it's not that husbands and wives shouldn't talk about how God leads. That's not the lesson. But, it's a temptation. You have a sense God has there's something God specifically wants you to do. You see it in His Word. And it's plain and obvious to you. You read that verse just as well as anybody else did. You know what you're supposed to do. But you go and you want to talk to people, and what you're really seeking for is for people to tell you it's really not that big a deal, it's not necessary. That's really what you're after. It's the same way, like as a pastor, you get this all the time. Somebody comes seeking counsel, and what they really want is for you to tell them that they're doing the right thing. They don't really want to hear that what they're doing is a bad idea. They just want you to say, go for it, I'm behind you. And as a pastor, you want to be able to tell people that, but you want their good more than that. And so there's times you just say, brother, sister, this isn't right. The Lord would lead another way. Look at these texts. Listen, I can't tell you how many times we've had people come and it's just like they don't want to hear it. And many times it's that very thing that'll cause a rupture in a relationship that's not healed for years. It's incredible. Right? What does Scripture say? He who isolates himself seeks his own desires. Right? This is the way it is. But so here it is. He doesn't do that. He didn't consult with her. When he was faced with the tremendous cost, he didn't say, this is a big deal. It involves a lot of people. I'm going to go talk to everybody. I'm going to take a poll, right? Pro-circumcision, stand over here. Anti-circumcision, stand over here. Pro-covenant, anti-covenant, what do we want to decide? It wasn't up for debate. He was going to follow God. Like Joshua, right? As for me and you guys do what you want. As for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. He was determined. And we need that. It's the only proper response. And think about it. God came and said, walk before me, right? Concern yourself with my purposes, and then be blameless. Here's the requirements. And he leaves. The only proper response is to do it. Without equivocation, without hesitation. Without seeking others to persuade you of another way. Or a way that you could kind of do it halfway, and that would maybe count before the Lord. So this is Abram's response. It's a wonderful response. It's the only proper response. Thankfully, this was his response. It moves the story forward. I can't imagine if Abraham had said, I think I'm just happy with Ishmael. Like, Ishmael's my boy. You told me you're going to give him certain things. That's enough for me. I don't really need to be all in. I can just what I have of you now is enough. I'm not really seeking or looking for anything more. I'm content with the fellowship that I have with God now, despite how much you've promised me in the future. So may the Lord help us, in the sense, to be like, Abram, the father of the faithful. Right? He's our father. There's a lot of unique things that happen in Abraham's life, but the man himself isn't unique, except for just what God did through him. He's just like you or I. We have the same faith he did. It tests us in the same hard ways. It hurts just as much. And this is how he responded. Well, that is Abraham's response to this covenant of circumcision. It's a lot to look at in one day. I know not for you guys, but for the rest of you, it was a lot of review, right? A lot of just kind of picking up things we've been talking about for weeks. But I don't think we could really understand it rightly if we don't have it all in front of us in one message. So anyway, are there any questions or comments, objections, anything anybody has? Speak now. Okay, well, I trust all of your questions on Genesis 17 are answered for now. Why don't we close in prayer? Heavenly Father, come to you again, and we ask that you would own this time as we gather together in your name, the name of your Son. You'd bless it to that end, that we would be encouraged and strengthened, further equipped for the work ahead. We think of those texts, Lord, that you've prepared these things in advance for us, that we should walk in them. So help us to do that. Help us in our time together as we're still gathered to encourage and provoke one another and to delve into one another's lives, that we might fulfill all the duties of love one to another. We might know the needs. Help us, Lord. We pray all this in the name of Christ. Amen.